Hi Year 12, so now we're moving into week 7 and this is just recapping on some things that we were speaking about last week. So for this video's focus and our lesson focus on Wednesday, we are going to be looking at the nature of the task, practice and feedback, as well as physical and environmental factors. So the nature of each task is going to be relatively different with varying levels of complexity. So we have our more simple tasks, which have few procedures and few variables. As you can see, we've got our complex tasks, which have many procedures and variables. And then just like we've discussed, we have our closed and open tasks, closed and open skills. So with our closed skills, they're predictable, and you can control the skill at your own pace. And with our open skills, they are unpredictable and they are also externally controlled. So the idea here is that each task can be changed in order to meet the needs of the learner. So the idea here is that we can alter tasks to make them more or less difficult, so based on the needs of the learner. So as you can see here, ideally we want to ensure that all performers or all athletes and students are being appropriately challenged. So they are working in that optimal learning zone, which is just shaded in the middle there. So this ultimately goes back to our information processing model. As you can see, if a performer is too anxious or worried, that can actually have a significant impact on their ability to pick up particular stimuli. And once again, if they're bored or they're frustrated, this can also have an impact on their ability to pick up particular stimuli in order to make a decision about performance. So once again, if the challenge is too great, anxiety and worry affect performance and learning in a negative way. If the challenge is too low, boredom and frustration also affect performance and learning in a negative way. And the model suggests that there is an optimal zone for effective learning where tasks can be done at the best level. So here are some factors which can impact the difficulty of the task. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go through them anyway. So as you can see, we've got the cognitive demands, so the level of thinking, the information to be processed. That goes back to the simple and complex tasks we just discussed previously. Safety of concern, so the risk of the task to the learner, the nature of the environment and the equipment. We've got here physical demands, so fitness and strength required, and the physical development of the athletes, the performers. And then we also have motor demands, the movements required, so the sequence and the complexity of the skills that are to be performed. So say for example, a fairly complex game such as volleyball, quite complex for our cognitive learners, something that the coach could do could include lowering the net, increasing the number of touches that each team can make before sending it over. And they could also be fairly relaxed on some other secondary rules. So say, for example, they could perhaps be more lenient with the carrying rule. So this way, the learner can actually just focus on performing the movement pattern within the correct context of the game. So what effectively the coach has done is that they have reduced the number of distractions, they've reduced the number of information available to the learner so that they can just really focus on doing the correct movement pattern within the correct context of the game. So some other factors which can affect learning also include the physical and environmental factors. So that would include physical and natural elements, so rain, wind, terrain, snow conditions in the crowd. So for example, the wind, you'd need to consider the wind before throwing a discus, and the same for archery and other shooting sports. Another example would be in cricket. The cricket players can sometimes not actually see the ball. Manufactured or man-made elements include equipment, rule modifications, and it's here that we would reduce distractions. So going back to a cognitive player, for example, if we have a fairly complex task and a fairly open task, it's here we could actually modify the game in order to close it up and make it more simple for our cognitive players. Or once again, we can also here emphasize a particular part of the game which requires a particular skill. So going back to table tennis, Mr. Day giving double points, for example, for using the forehand stroke on the right side of the table tennis table tennis table, using, say, a backhand stroke on the left side. So that can really increase the chances of using a particular skill within the context of the game. And we'll be talking about this next term, but psychological factors. So right here, we're talking about emotional reactions in the learner affecting the skill execution. So it can have both positive and negative effects. So just like we were previously talking about, this goes back to arousal levels. So knowing that stress and anxiety can have a negative impact on selective attention, because quite often the athlete might be placed in a position where they're acting on the wrong cue, or once again, low arousal levels where they're actually unable to pick up on particular skill cues. So once again, all of this stuff goes right back to the information processing model. So we have different types of practice. Just my Year 12s, just make sure that you are familiar with this, because these types of questions have come up most years in the exam, particularly around massed practice and distributed practice. So we've got our fixed practice. So this is sometimes also known as skills and drills, and it involves repeatedly practicing a whole skill in order to strengthen the motor program. So in order to strengthen the motor program within the long-term memory. So this type of practice is best used with discrete and closed skills. We have our variable practice. So this type of practice involves repeating a skill in a changeable and dynamic environment. So these changes reflect those seen when skills are used in games, so more for your open skills. So variable practice, you might have heard of the term game sense, so that very much adopts this view. So it exposes players to information sources that they would normally have within the game. So they have the opportunity to make sure that they're reacting and using skills based on particular information sources. So it really gives them the opportunity to reinforce the motor program based on particular cues and information sources they pick up within a game, or it forces them to make changes. So the emphasis here is on using the correct skill within the correct context of the game. So what skill to use and when to use it. So you often see that, yes, as I said before, with game sense. Then we also have massed practice. So this is a continuous form of practice which is best used for simple skills. So I've got an example here, would be in a rally of badminton, where the learner must repeatedly perform drop shots. So this causes fatigue and therefore simulates the late stages of a game. Another example would be a professional tennis player spending 30 minutes on their backhand stroke to correct a problem with technique. So just like we previously said, it's used to produce fatigue within a player. So that really simulates the later stages of a game. But for massed practice, because it is quite monotonous and, I guess you could say, boring, it probably wouldn't be best for the cognitive players, because just like we spoke about last week, for our cognitive learners and for our learners within their early stages of development, it's really important that they're having fun and that they are getting an appropriate level of arousal. And then we also have distributed practice. So it's one of the more common and popular forms of practice where skills or techniques are practiced in blocks of time and then they're followed by periods of rest. So it's good for difficult skills and keeping motivation levels quite high. So we've been spending a fair bit of time talking about the different types of feedback. So as you're all aware, we have knowledge of performance, KP, and knowledge of results. So for our cognitive players, they really rely on feedback provided from the coach, particularly with regards to their movements, because they're unable to detect exactly what went wrong. Whereas for our more autonomous players, they have that information stored within their long-term memory and they usually know straight away exactly what went wrong and how to fix it. So feedback actually decreases as the performer becomes more proficient. So as you can see here in the table, feedback seeks to provide 3 different functions. So it seeks to motivate learners, and this is or, change immediate performance or reinforce learning. So feedback can be delivered at various times. So it can be delivered prior to the skill with accompanying with obviously perhaps a demonstration, during the skill and after the skill. So it's really important as well with feedback that the coach is mindful of the feedback they're providing, because obviously it can actually have a negative influence on the psychology of the performer. So that goes straight back to arousal levels with our stressed and highly anxious players. It can really affect their perceptual mechanisms, so their ability to be able to detect information sources which help to guide their performance. And once again, if you've got a player that has low levels of arousal, they're often actually unable to really pick up on information to sources and detect those. So feedback delivery is referred to as feedback delay. So feedback delay is the time between the performance of a skill and the delivery or the reception of the information. So once again, relatively common sense information. If you're giving a player feedback during their performance, they're able to fix it up then and there. Whereas if you tell them after they've actually performed the action, then this is really going to, I guess, impede their ability to fix that up at the right time. So as you can see here, we have a kind of lots of different types of feedback. So we have our continuous feedback, which is provided to the players throughout the execution of the skill. Terminal feedback is the key term that we use when we're talking about feedback that's provided to the player at the end of their performance. We've spoken quite a lot about internal and external feedback. However, internal feedback would be the feedback that an autonomous player receives, letting them know how their performance went and how they can alter that to improve their performance next time. So like we were talking about previously, this is why the cognitive players really rely on external feedback from their coaches, because they actually are unable to identify internally how they can improve performance. Externally, which is what we were speaking about previously, the feedback received through an external source like the coach, so it can be visual, verbal, or audible. Then we also have negative and positive feedback. So negative feedback is feedback that focuses on poor things related to performance and things that need to be improved. And then we also have positive feedback, so feedback provided that focuses on the good things related to performance. So positive feedback could effectively reinforce a particular motor program, whereas negative feedback could ultimately ask the player to to force changes to their motor program. And then just like we previously spoke about, knowledge of results. So knowledge is that focuses on the outcome, and then we also have knowledge of performance. So feedback that focuses on the processes involved during the performance. So as a coach, it's really important that when you are giving feedback, you really understand the cognitive development of the learners, of the players, the emotional development of them as well, their type of personality, their motivation levels, the learner's knowledge of the task, the coach's ability as well to demonstrate, and also other means of feedback. So for example, perhaps it might be, I often see down the road mums and dads filming their kids surfing, and then later on they go home and they look at that. So there's lots of different things that you need to consider, but one of the really main important ones is really focusing and being aware of the players' arousal levels and their ability to be able to pick up on information sources.